We are here today with Hemen Sampat, an executive director at JP Morgan, who has spent the last 2 decades of his sell-side research career specializing in alternative data. So, Hemen, we are all used to traditional structured data from standard sources like governments and company earnings. What is alt data?
Yes, alternative data, or alt data for short, consists of various data sets that complements traditional sources of data you just mentioned. And this alt data space consists of interesting sources like think of products and pricing and inventory information, store locations, cell phone location data, credit cards, weather, satellite, you name it. When you bring in all these things together to tell a story, that's what alt data is all about.
Where can someone find alt data?
Very interesting. And the way I like to think about it is it always starts with a question. You can't go about looking for alt data. And there's a difference I want to highlight. Alt data is not big data. Alt data is there to specifically answer your debate. So when you look for one or more sources that help answer that question, that's when you need to start with. This kind of data can be collected in many ways. One is you scrape your own. So you're creating web bots to scrape the data you care for. You can purchase from a third-party vendor. You can go to a market data provider, which we all know some of the big names across the world. And just interestingly, over my last couple of decades of career, I've seen so many number of data sets and providers increasing, and that number has gone up tenfold from less than 50 a couple of decades ago to like 500 and continues to grow today. And so this data is becoming a commodity. It's about how you use it. That's the most important part.
So how is alt data used for investment research?
Yeah, so think of the couple of things we've just discussed, which is how do you source it and what it is. Now, once you have identified these sources, then the next challenge is to decipher what is helpful and what is not so helpful for your specific question. What data set is useful for your analysis? More importantly, be aware of the biases that have already creeped into the data sources. And that's when you need to focus a lot on the quality check of the data, even before you start using it. Once all those phases are done, then comes the data mashup exercise, where you are really trying to tell a story. Now, let me walk you through a couple of examples of how this can happen, right? In an investment research world, think of the price scrapes we just discussed about as one of the examples. So if I track pricing of some goods over time and I look at the discounts over time, how is it relevant to a certain brand or a competing brand? Who are the demographic who purchase those products? Is it going in or out of fashion? All these things together will tell a story along with the demographic information to be able to assess a specific company's or apparel company to start with. Then one other interesting example is about location data sets. So here I want to focus on brick and mortar locations, and let's take an example of two large quick service restaurants who are starting to sell coffee. And how would they compete if one of them starts discounting heavily, right? You look at the store locations of each of those chains across the entire country, break it up by regions, look at which demographics they're serving. Some of them could be in affluent areas, some of them could be in middle class areas, and so on. What is the footfall in those locations as well? Because you can use that using cell phone tracking data. So when you put all these layers of information together, then you can assess which of those two brands is better positioned to then capture that coffee market share, right? And let me give you a third example, which is one of the most interesting I've come across so far. This is to do with fleet and flight data analysis. And if you think of one of the large online companies who takes their name after a rainforest, they started flying their own aircraft. And how would you assess that versus the incumbents of how does it affect the incumbents? So you start with looking at their fleet, looking at the flight information every day of those aircraft, looking at the warehouse footprints, and then try to assess how does the competition get affected when this player becomes bigger and bigger in their delivery supply chain. So these are some of the examples where it's relevant in the investment research world, how all data is used as complementary to the traditional data sources, which will never go away, of course. The quarterly filings, the company announcement, those are the most relevant. Then you give this additional information to the analyst who's the expert. They make an overall assessment of the story.
So how would one use alt data to study India better?
This is very close to my heart. And in India, as you know, there's a vast amount of untapped data sets and huge potential to be explored. And just consider some of the data sets we've discussed earlier. And also include things like night lights, satellite imagery, private database providing household data surveys, and weather information, cell phone locations. If you think of combining all these together in one single great dashboard, so all these layers are existing in a neat dashboard, this becomes a very powerful tool for the businesses or public and private sector insights to then come up with better answers. Now, let's take one example each, one in the private sector and one in the public sector. Yeah. In the private sector, think of banks as an example. If they're trying to set up or refine their ATM location as a footprint and then assess that along with the competition of what's competition doing, where should they put up the right locations, you can start including all these layers. And so, for example, obviously their own footprint locations, where does competition exists, what are the retail locations around it where people could be frequenting, and hence, oh, let me make an ATM trip as well, and look at the footfall location using cell phone location data. So if you bring in all these together, it gives the bank a very good assessment of what they can plan for next, whether it's reduction of certain locations, increase certain locations in other cities, etc. So that's a private sector example where this can be beneficial. Now, much bigger challenging aspect is the public sector and public policy changes. So if you think of one of the examples we discussed, which is masses, locations, and the movement of masses over time. If you think of cell phone location data, overlay their work and home location data, and then see at which hour of the day is a commute happening one way. What are the routes they are using for commute? What are the transportation types they're using for commute, as car, railways, public buses, etc. If you look at these patterns and you then identify the choke points of I need to reach to my office in downtown location, I stay 2 hours away, how do I best get this citizen to that location effectively, right? So when you use these data sets together, then you can have a better public policy and planning changes over time to plan railroads, roadways, better traffic management, etc. So these are some of the large and cool things you can do with these data sets. And I think India is just beginning to scratch the surface of this.
This is fantastic. Thank you, Hemen, for talking to us today about alternative data.
Yeah, thanks for having me over.